On June 4, 1943, Unteroffizier Herman Butcher stepped off the gangplank at Norfolk Naval Base in Virginia, his hands gripping the railing for balance. The Atlantic crossing had left him weak and unsteady. 14 days of rolling seas, bitter cold, and cramped quarters had drained him. The smell of salt and oil still clung to his uniform, mingling with the faint scent of coal from the ship's engine room. Herman had expected something different, something closer to the harsh and rigid world he had learned about in the Reich. He had prepared himself for fear, for violence, for endless suspicion. He had pictured snarling Americans with rifles ready, barking orders and demanding obedience. What he saw instead stopped him cold. The dock was alive with movement, but it was calm, almost casual. Men and women worked side by side on cranes and forklifts, loading supplies with mechanical precision. They didn't shout at each other. Children played near the edge of the docks, seemingly unconcerned by the ships or soldiers around them. Racial mixing, something Herman had been taught was impossible outside of chaos, was everywhere. Black and white Americans moved together as naturally as if they had always done so. The scene struck him with a quiet shock. Here was a society at war, yet it did not look afraid, it did not look rigid, and it did not look like the oppressive, suspicious machine he had been told America was. As the prisoners were led through the base, the reality of the American military and civilian world revealed itself more fully. Massive factories and warehouses stretched along the harbor, chimneys puffing white smoke into the sky. The machines roared and clanked with efficiency, but there was a rhythm to it, a sense of order without panic. Workers in overalls moved with purpose, yet there was no frantic shouting, no fear of mistakes, no oppressive weight of authority pressing down on them. Herman could not reconcile what he was seeing with the propaganda that had been drilled into him. He had been taught that Americans were decadent, weak, and cruel, but here was a nation producing on a scale that seemed limitless, and yet it did so with a calmness that felt almost unimaginable. The POWs were processed according to the Geneva Convention, and here too, Herman felt his assumptions crumble. He had expected harsh treatment, forced labor, and contempt. Instead, the officers greeted them with formal politeness. Each man was checked for health, given medical care, and treated with respect. Herman noticed nurses attending to a fellow prisoner's wounded hand with care, offering him penicillin, the same medicine American soldiers received. He saw that kosher meals were prepared for Jewish prisoners, and that special attention was paid to dietary needs. The POWs were not abused, not mocked, not forced to endure humiliation. They were quite simply treated as human beings. Even the first meal at the base became an experience that Herman would remember for the rest of his life. They were seated in a large mess hall, tables lined neatly with white plates and utensils. The smell of cooked vegetables, bread, and meat filled the air, a scent familiar yet strangely comforting. But what stunned Herman most was who shared the hall with them. American sailors and soldiers moved about, eating their meals alongside the German prisoners. There was no separation, no distinction other than the uniform each man wore. The POWs could hardly believe it. In his mind, this was impossible. Surely, he thought, the Americans were preparing some trick, some trap. But there was none. The men ate, spoke quietly, and even smiled at one another across the tables. Herman could feel the disbelief gnawing at him. Every small detail of arrival seemed to challenge the world he had known. The officers spoke with courtesy, addressing prisoners by rank and name. Beds were assigned in clean, orderly barracks, with sheets and blankets provided. Medical officers checked each man carefully, looking for signs of illness or injury. Herman noticed that Americans did not just treat prisoners as an obligation. There was a sense of care in their actions, a deliberate attention to detail that seemed to honor the humanity of each individual. Even when he was asked questions about his unit and his service, Herman felt no threat in the tone of the questions. They were practical, necessary, but never accusatory. The overall scene, the calm docks, the industrious yet composed civilians, the orderly processing of prisoners, created a tension in Herman's mind. He had been raised on stories of American cruelty and incompetence. Nazi teachers had painted a picture of a nation on the brink of collapse under its own freedoms, a people who would panic under pressure. Yet here, in the middle of a world war, Herman saw neither panic nor cruelty. He saw a society functioning efficiently, with rules, order, and respect, even for the enemy. This realization did not come all at once. It grew slowly, a creeping awareness that the world he had been taught to believe in, the rigid, obedient, fearful world, was not universal. He noticed women operating forklifts and other machinery, something completely forbidden under Nazi ideology. These were capable, confident workers, moving with authority, checking their equipment, coordinating with men around them. Herman had been taught that women were fragile, suited only to the home, to supporting men from behind the scenes. Yet here was proof of the opposite. Women integral to the war effort, trusted with complex machinery, part of the economic engine that fueled the military. Children played nearby, a detail that should have terrified any German soldier trained to expect danger everywhere. But there was no chaos. No screams of alarm. No sense of danger. The children were free to move, free to laugh, free to exist within the presence of war, and it left Herman uneasy. In his experience, children had to be hidden, protected, confined. The casual freedom he saw in Norfolk was alien, and yet somehow it worked. By the time the POWs were moved to the transport area for their next journey inland, Herman's mind was full of contradictions. He could not reconcile the images before him with the rigid lessons of his past. America was at war. Yes, but it was a war conducted not only with strength but with confidence, openness, and above all humanity. And for the first time, Herman Butcher and many of his fellow prisoners realized that the world was far larger, more complex, and more capable of moral action than the narrow vision they had carried with them across the Atlantic. The arrival at Norfolk Naval Base was more than a first step in captivity. It was a first step in the slow, unsettling process of learning that their enemies could act with decency, fairness, and even generosity. Herman felt a deep tension within him, part fear, part curiosity, part awe. It was the beginning of a journey not just across a foreign land, but into a new understanding of what a nation and its people could be even in the midst of war. By the evening, as the prisoners settled into their temporary barracks, Herman could still see the docks from the small window of his room. Smoke from the factories rose in calm columns into the sky, and the distant hum of machinery formed a steady background to the sounds of the harbor. He thought of the propaganda he had been raised on and felt its weight slowly shifting. In its place, a new, confusing, and compelling reality was taking shape. America was not what he had been told. It was something else entirely, alive, confident, and, above all, human. This realization would not change him overnight, but as Herman lay on his cot that night, he understood that he had witnessed something rare and profound. The first impression of America, a nation at war, yet moving with the ease and dignity of a people secure in themselves, was a shock that no textbook or lecture could have prepared him for. After being processed at Norfolk Naval Base, the German POWs, including Unteroffizier Hermann Butcher, were herded onto trains for transport further inland. Herman had expected something harsh, even demeaning. He had imagined narrow, crowded boxcars with no ventilation, the stench of human bodies pressed together, and the constant barking of guards. What he encountered instead was almost unbelievable. The train cars resembled regular passenger cars, complete with cushioned seats and windows that could be opened to let in fresh air. The interior smelled faintly of wood polish and clean fabric, a smell Herman associated with the middle-class homes he had seen on rare leave in Germany before the war. As the train slowly rumbled away from the docks, Herman and the other POWs pressed their faces to the windows. Outside, the American countryside rolled by in green fields, clusters of trees, and towns that seemed ordinary and yet extraordinary to them. They were moving through a world untouched by fear, a world that did not resemble the tight, regimented, fearful environment they had been raised to believe all free peoples must live under. Children ran along the tracks in some areas, waving at the train, their faces bright with curiosity and delight rather than suspicion. In small towns, women and men paused to watch the strange procession of foreign soldiers passing through their streets. There were no jeers, no anger, no violent protests, only curiosity. Some smiled, some waved, and some simply looked, puzzled at the oddity of German soldiers in American uniforms, traveling quietly among them. Factories began appearing as the train moved inland, their large brick walls stretching for blocks, smokestacks puffing out white clouds of steam and smoke. Herman's eyes widened as he observed that these factories were completely uncamouflaged, open for anyone to see. There were no hidden bunkers or secret production lines. He had been trained to expect an economy driven by secrecy and fear, as if industrial achievement in a free country could only exist behind walls guarded by armed men. Here, machinery clanked and hissed in plain sight, belts and wheels turning with astonishing speed. Workers, men and women alike, moved through the factories with confidence, issuing orders, operating complex machines, and handling heavy materials with skill. Herman noticed that black and white Americans worked together without friction, their collaboration seamless. Even more startling to Herman was how casually the workers discarded materials. Rolls of fabric, bundles of scrap metal, and crates of food were thrown aside without apparent concern. In Germany, such items would have been carefully salvaged, rationed, or recycled. Each piece was precious. But here, in this abundant country, waste seemed ordinary. Herman watched a worker toss a loaf of bread into a bin simply because it was slightly misshapen. The sheer abundance of resources, the casual way they were handled, made Herman's head spin. He could not comprehend a society where survival was not constantly at the forefront of thought, where people had so much that minor imperfections could be thrown away without guilt or panic. The POWs began to notice other signs of difference as the train journeyed further. Women held positions of authority in both factories and towns. They directed men, supervised machinery, and sometimes wore uniforms that signified leadership roles. Herman had been taught that women were delicate, subordinate, and incapable of real responsibility outside the home. Here, they moved with confidence, speaking firmly, giving commands, and being obeyed without question. It was unsettling, in a way that made Herman feel small and unsure of the rules he had been trained to follow. Public opinion, too, fascinated Herman. At stops along the railway, he could hear ordinary Americans arguing with one another, sometimes loudly, over matters of politics, labor, and even the ongoing war. Newspapers were displayed openly in store windows, and some shops had boards showing letters to the editor or political cartoons critical of government policies. Herman had been taught that in the Reich, questioning authority was dangerous, even forbidden. Here, citizens could disagree publicly, challenge leaders, and even mock them, all without fear of immediate reprisal. The freedom of expression was a concept he had known in theory, but had never seen practiced on such a large scale. As the train carried the POWs further west, the countryside began to shift from urban factories to sprawling farmland. Herman noticed Americans working the fields with machinery and hand tools, but again, abundance was everywhere. The fields were filled with crops stretching as far as the eye could see, and workers left excess produce to rot or be composted. Storage bins overflowed with fresh vegetables, crates of fruit were stacked high, and even when small mishaps occurred, fallen apples, crushed tomatoes, the farmers did not panic. In Germany, a crop loss, no matter how small, would have been a catastrophe, treated as a personal failure or a national emergency. The sense of security in these American farms, the casual confidence that surplus existed, left Herman both confused and amazed. In the train cars, conversations among the prisoners began to shift. Initial hostility and suspicion were gradually replaced by wonder and unease. They compared what they saw in America with what they knew at home. Factories, farms, towns, and cities seemed to operate on an entirely different set of rules, rules that allowed freedom, human dignity, and efficiency to coexist. Even prisoners who had been loyal supporters of the Reich began to whisper among themselves, questioning the lessons of their youth. They were silent at first, afraid of appearing weak or disloyal, but the images they had witnessed over these first few days could not be ignored. Food availability was another source of astonishment. At train stops, Herman caught glimpses of grocery stores stocked with canned goods, fresh bread, candy, and household items. Shelves were full, and store owners displayed wares proudly rather than hiding them. Germans considered even a loaf of bread precious. Here, bread was everywhere, and people seemed to take abundance for granted. Herman could not stop thinking about how different this world was from his own, where the scarcity of everyday goods shaped every choice, every action, and every thought. By the time the train finally approached Camp Hearn, Texas, the prisoners had absorbed enough of America's abundance and freedoms to feel a subtle, unsettling shift in their mindset. The propaganda of their homeland, which had painted America as weak, decadent, and morally corrupt, began to crack under the weight of reality. Herman realized that abundance was not chaos, that freedom did not result in collapse, and that a society could be both productive and humane. It was an idea he had never allowed himself to consider before, that a nation could flourish, not through rigid control, fear, or punishment, but through trust, confidence, and respect for human dignity. As the prisoners disembarked from the train, the sheer scale of the American landscape and its operations impressed them further. The town near the camp was orderly, clean, and bustling with life. People moved with purpose but without tension, talking openly with neighbors, children playing in the streets, and stores offering goods freely. Herman felt a mix of awe, disbelief, and a strange sense of relief. The America he had feared, The America that had been portrayed as a land of danger and cruelty did not exist. Instead, he encountered a country vibrant with energy, confident in its abundance, and secure in the freedoms it allowed its citizens. By the end of that day, Herman and the other POWs understood that the journey inland was more than just a physical trip. It was a journey into a completely new worldview. They had begun to see a society that functioned not by fear, not by oppression, but by trust, confidence, and respect. Every factory, every farm, every town they passed challenged the ideology they had been trained to believe in, and every observation left an impression that would shape their understanding for years to come. The train ride had introduced them to America in its fullest form, not a terrifying enemy, not a fragile, decadent land, but a nation capable of abundance, human dignity, and freedom. It was the first major crack in the armor of Nazi indoctrination, a crack that would slowly widen in the months and years ahead. Herman Butcher knew, even if he could not yet fully understand it, that nothing would ever look the same again. When the train finally rolled into the small town of Hearn, Texas, Herman Butcher and the other German POWs stepped onto a platform that seemed almost surreal. The sun was hot and bright in the early afternoon, casting long shadows of the soldiers and the tall, thin pine trees that lined the station. Unlike the grim, controlled images of prisoner camps Herman had imagined, the area around Camp Hearn felt open, calm, and surprisingly inviting. The streets were clean, the few townspeople they saw went about their business with curiosity rather than hostility, and children waved from porches as the new arrivals passed by. Herman could hardly believe that this quiet, orderly town would be home to enemy soldiers in the middle of a world war. The camp itself was unlike any prison Herman had expected. The barracks were neatly arranged in rows, each building modest in size but clearly well-maintained. Electricity lit the rooms, and plumbing brought running water to every building. Hot water flowed from the taps, a luxury Herman had never taken for granted in Germany, where shortages and rationing made such simple comforts rare. For many of the prisoners, the ability to bathe in warm water after a long journey across the country felt almost miraculous. The combination of cleanliness, comfort, and order seemed to contradict everything Herman had been taught about the treatment of enemy combatants. Camp Hearn offered more than just physical comfort. There were libraries filled with books in both German and English. Some of these books had been banned in Germany, works that the Nazi regime considered dangerous or subversive. POWs could borrow novels, history books, scientific texts, and philosophy volumes. For Herman, this was astonishing. Reading had always been a private pleasure in Germany, one carefully monitored by the state. Here, he could freely explore ideas without fear of punishment. The library became a refuge, a place to think, question, and slowly begin to see the world outside the narrow lens of Nazi propaganda. Medical care at Camp Hearn was advanced and comprehensive. The hospital had equipment that Herman had only seen in textbooks or in distant hospitals in Berlin. Doctors and nurses treated the prisoners with professional care, administering vaccinations, checking for chronic conditions, and providing penicillin and other modern medicines. For a soldier who had endured battlefield injuries and harsh realities of wartime Germany, the quality of care was almost shocking. Herman saw men with broken bones walking again, infections cured quickly, and wounds treated with compassion rather than neglect. The fairness of this treatment, equal to that received by American soldiers, made him reconsider the idea that prisoners were meant to suffer simply because they were enemies. Work at Camp Hearn was structured but humane. Prisoners earned wages for their labor, which they could use at the camp canteen to buy treats, toiletries, or small luxuries. Herman and others worked on nearby farms and ranches, tending crops and caring for animals, or in local factories contributing to the broader American war effort. The work was often challenging, but it was honest labor, and it was respected. Herman began to notice a difference between the efficiency of American industry and the strict, fearful obedience demanded in Germany. Here, work was driven by skill, pride, and mutual cooperation rather than blind fear. Even small mistakes were corrected with guidance, not punishment, and workers, including POWs, were treated as capable individuals rather than disposable tools. One of the most unsettling aspects for Herman was observing the racial dynamics within the camp and its surroundings. At Hearn, black and white workers sometimes shared duties, and in certain situations, prisoners were treated better than black American soldiers stationed nearby. The rigid, hateful hierarchy Herman had learned to accept in Germany seemed almost laughable when confronted with the complex but functioning reality of American society. While racism existed, it was tempered by law, custom, and circumstance, and Herman could see how ordinary people navigated those boundaries with pragmatism rather than ideology. Witnessing these interactions challenged his beliefs about race and hierarchy. It was not a sudden enlightenment, but a slow, nagging doubt that grew each day. Education was another key element of life at Camp Hearn. The POWs were encouraged to attend courses in English, history, and even college-level subjects. They could learn about sciences, literature, and mathematics, all of which had practical applications as well as intellectual value. Herman was amazed that he could sit in a classroom and discuss ideas openly with others, sometimes even arguing, without fear of retribution. Learning became a source of empowerment. Prisoners were also allowed to hold their own self-governance councils, organizing activities, overseeing schedules, and addressing minor disputes. This level of trust and responsibility was unheard of in Nazi Germany for anyone deemed the enemy. Herman began to understand that Americans believed prisoners could manage themselves and make good decisions, and that treating them as responsible individuals produced better results than coercion ever could. By the time the year drew to a close, Herman and many of his fellow POWs had undergone a subtle but profound transformation. They had been exposed to democracy in action, not through sermons or indoctrination, but through lived experience. They saw that society could function without fear, that criticism could coexist with stability, and that efficiency could be driven by personal pride and freedom rather than oppression. These lessons would shape not only the rest of their time in captivity, but also their lives after the war, forming the foundation for a new understanding of governance, human rights, and personal responsibility. By the end of the war in 1945, the results of this unique approach to handling POWs were clear. Escape attempts were rare, and acts of sabotage were almost non-existent. Most prisoners, including Herman Butcher, willingly participated in camp life and work programs. The combination of humane treatment, responsibility, and exposure to a functioning democratic society had created an environment where the prisoners no longer saw themselves purely as enemies. They were participants in a system that respected them as humans. Surveys conducted by American authorities in the post-war years revealed the magnitude of the change. A majority of the POWs returned to Germany with a newfound appreciation for democracy and American ideals. Many had internalized lessons about freedom, fairness, and civic responsibility, carrying them back into a country that had been devastated by war and authoritarian rule. These men became ambassadors for change, often quietly, in the rebuilding of West Germany. They understood that a society could function with freedom, trust, and respect, and they brought these lessons into their post-war lives. Thousands of former POWs eventually chose to immigrate to the United States. For them, America had become not just a place of captivity, but a place of opportunity, safety, and human dignity. Many became citizens, integrated into communities across the country, and built new lives as workers, entrepreneurs, and professionals. Others returned to Germany, but carried the lessons learned in America into their careers as educators, engineers, business leaders, and political figures. In this way, the influence of humane treatment and exposure to democratic systems extended far beyond the confines of the camps themselves, shaping generations to come. Reunions decades later, letters exchanged across continents, and memoirs written by former POWs all confirm the lasting nature of this transformation. Herman Butcher, like many others, maintained friendships with Americans he had met in the camps, carrying a deep sense of respect and gratitude for a society that had treated him not as a foe to be punished, but as a human being deserving of dignity. These personal connections reinforced the lessons learned, proving that ideological change could endure long after the physical experience of captivity had ended. Historians today agree that the treatment of German POWs in the United States from 1943 to 1946 stands as one of the most successful examples in history of ideological transformation through humane exposure rather than coercion. By giving prisoners access to education, freedom within limits, responsibility, and respectful treatment, the United States demonstrated that an enemy could be influenced more effectively through example than through force. The long-term impact on post-war Germany and the lives of thousands of individuals who chose to build bridges between nations underscores the power of humane policy and moral leadership. In many ways, the story of POWs like Herman Butcher is a story of hope. It is a testament to the idea that human beings can change, that even those trained to hate and fear can learn empathy, respect, and democratic values when treated with dignity. The camps in America were not just prisons, they were classrooms, communities, and laboratories for understanding the power of humane treatment. By the time the last POWs were repatriated, the United States had quietly rewritten the rules of prisoner management, showing that morality and practicality could coexist, and that the seeds of a new world could be planted even in the harshest of circumstances. Herman's journey from fear and indoctrination to understanding and appreciation illustrates the broader transformation of a generation. A generation that, had it remained in the rigid ideological confines of Nazi Germany, might have carried hatred and authoritarian thinking into the post-war world. Instead, many returned with a vision of democracy, respect for human dignity, and the belief that cooperation, freedom, and trust could build a stronger society than fear and oppression ever could. The story of these POWs reminds us that true change is rarely forced. It is nurtured through experience, exposure, and respect for the human spirit.